At 69, Gary Kemp found himself seated in a dim room filled with the quiet shimmer of late afternoon light, gold fading into gray, the kind of twilight that makes every breath feel like a confession waiting to escape. The years had softened his voice, but not the memories. They hovered behind him like silhouettes reflected on a fogged mirror, always close, always silent, always demanding to be acknowledged. For half a century, the world had known Gary Kemp as a man of elegance on stage, precision in sound, and a charisma that seemed untouchable. But on that evening, with the weight of time resting on his shoulders, he whispered a sentence that fractured the silence. "There are 5 betrayals," he murmured, "that changed my life forever." He didn't say it with anger, nor bitterness, but with the kind of weary honesty that only arrives when a man has walked through decades of applause, disappointment, love, ambition, and loss, sometimes all in the same breath. As the light dimmed further, casting long shadows across the wooden floor, he let his hands fall still. Hands that had written anthems, held trust, and released it. Hands that had carried more than fame. They had carried wounds. And now, for the first time, he allowed those wounds to surface. But who were the 5 faces he could never erase? And why did their stories still shape the man he had become? There is a quiet street in Islington where Gary Kemp's childhood still seems to breathe in the cracks of the pavement, in the soft echo of footsteps that no longer belong to him. Born in 1959, he grew up in a modest flat where the walls were thin, the winters were cold, and dreams had to be carved out of silence rather than handed down. His mother's voice, gentle but always tired, floated through the rooms like a lullaby held together by hope. His father, a printer, returned home each night with ink on his hands and restraint in his gestures, a man shaped by duty more than desire. Gary, the young boy with wide eyes and a heart too tender for the world he saw, learned early that promises could be fragile. He witnessed arguments blur into quiet apologies fade into distance, and distance harden into silence. It was in those narrow hallways that he first understood how trust could tremble. Music became his refuge, not a hobby, an escape. The old radio in the corner was his first window into a world where voices didn't break, where melodies didn't abandon you halfway. It taught him rhythm, but it also taught him caution. Every song carried the ghost of something lost. By the time he reached adolescence, Gary had grown into someone who smiled easily but guarded fiercely, a boy who could love deeply yet expected the world to shift beneath his feet at any moment. And somewhere in that fragile beginning lay the seed of the man who, at 69, would admit he still carried 5 betrayals in the quietest part of his memory. Fame did not burst into Gary Kemp's life like a sudden explosion of light. It arrived slowly, first as a whisper in crowded rehearsal rooms, then as a murmur beneath the streets of London, and finally as a roar that seemed almost too loud for the quiet, observant boy from Islington. But once Spandau Ballet stepped into the pulsing neon energy of late 1970s London, something irreversible shifted. The city was reinventing itself, and Gary, with his sharp intuition and restless ambition, rose with it as though destiny had been waiting for him to open the door. The stages grew larger, the audiences multiplied, the applause stretched long enough to blur into something dreamlike, almost unreal. He wrote songs with a precision that masked vulnerability, each lyric carrying both elegance and an unspoken ache. Melodies shaped not just by inspiration, but by the tremors of a boy who had learned early how fragile trust could be. Fans saw confidence. But Gary heard something else beneath the music, the uneven rhythm of a heart still searching for solid ground. Success came fast enough to feel like vertigo. Chart-topping hits, months-long tours, interviews that demanded charm even when he felt hollow, admiration from strangers who believed they knew him. All of it wrapped around him like a golden storm, dazzling yet suffocating. And as the band climbed higher, Gary began to notice the shadows cast by the spotlight. Some smiles no longer reached the eyes. Some promises felt rehearsed. Some friendships shifted subtly, too subtly to confront, yet too sharply to ignore. There was one friend in particular, someone he had once called a brother, Their bond had survived the early struggles, the tiny venues, the endless nights writing songs that might never be heard. But fame, with its strange gravity, had begun to pull them apart. The distance showed itself quietly. Unanswered calls, curt replies, a tone colder than Gary remembered. No dramatic betrayal, just the slow erosion of trust, the kind that hurts more because it offers no reason, no closure. One night backstage, as red velvet curtains swallowed the last echo of applause, Gary stood alone beneath the soft glow of dressing room lights. In the mirror, he saw not the triumphant star the world believed him to be, but a man who had begun to recognize the price of ascent. Because light doesn't only illuminate, it reveals, and not everyone beside you wants to be seen. From that moment, loneliness slipped into his success like a thin strand of smoke, barely visible, impossible to chase away. The first true fracture came quietly, almost elegantly, as if betrayal preferred to move without sound. It happened in a rehearsal room drenched in the pale glow of winter light, one of those afternoons when London felt heavy, suspended between rain and silence. Gary remembered the stillness more than the words. Stillness, and the sense that something once solid had begun to dissolve. It was a decision made behind closed doors, a conversation he was never invited to join, a project he believed belonged to all of them suddenly moved forward without him. No confrontation, no explanation, only a polite message, delivered too late, wrapped in the kind of courtesy that cuts deeper than anger. In that moment, Gary realized his trust had been misplaced. He had spent years offering loyalty with an open hand, assuming it would be received with equal sincerity. But the industry he lived in, brilliant, ruthless, intoxicating, had other rules. Rules written in shadows, in bargains unspoken, in loyalties that shifted like stage lights. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply watched the people he once believed in turn away ever so slightly, enough for him to understand. Success had never united them. It had only disguised their differences. That day, as he stepped out of the studio into the faint drizzle, he carried a new kind of silence with him. Not the silence of childhood shaped by survival, but the silence born from disappointment, heavier, sharper, more revealing. From then on, Gary kept certain names etched quietly inside him. Not out of vengeance, but because some wounds refuse to fade, no matter how much time pretends to heal them. 5 names, 5 stories, each one waiting in the dark for its turn to be told. 5 names, 5 wounds, 5 betrayals that shaped the man Gary Kemp would become. He spoke of them not with hatred, but with the worn-out tenderness of someone who has carried their weight for far too long, like stones kept in a coat pocket, cold and familiar. The friend who let success redraw the map. He had once been closer than a brother, one of the rare people Gary trusted before the world began to watch him. They had shared night buses, cheap takeaways, and dreams that felt too large for the rooms they practiced in. But fame twisted their paths. What once was camaraderie turned into quiet competition. Gary remembered the moment the laughter changed pitch, the encouragement dulled, and the eyes that used to look at him with warmth now measured him instead. The betrayal came in the form of distance, the unanswered calls, the decisions made without him, the subtle exclusion cloaked in politeness. It wasn't cruelty. It was abandonment by erosion. Somehow that hurt more. The collaborator who took more than credit. This one came during Spandau Ballet's brightest era, when their songs echoed across some continents and every word Gary wrote held weight. A collaborator he trusted, someone whose talent he admired, used that trust to claim ownership of work that wasn't his. Not publicly, not blatantly, but in conversations whispered into the right ears, in meetings where Gary's contributions were minimized, softened, blurred. It wasn't just professional theft. It was a quiet reshaping of truth. Gary learned then that creative betrayal leaves a bruise no audience can see. Because it doesn't strike the body, it strikes the soul of the work. She had entered his life during a period when the applause made him forget how fragile he truly was. With her, Gary allowed himself to believe in constancy again. He let down walls he had spent a lifetime building. But love, real love, demands honesty, and she offered everything but. The betrayal was not one moment, not one act, but a mosaic of half-truths, late-night silences, shifting stories, and affections shared elsewhere. When the truth surfaced, Gary didn't rage. He simply felt the floor tilt beneath him, as if the universe had confirmed what he had always feared. That love, too, could be temporary. Her absence left an imprint deeper than the applause ever could. The industry that lifted him then left him alone. There is a betrayal that comes not from a person, but from an entire system. One that applauds you when you rise and forgets you when you fall. For Gary, this wound came when trends shifted, when a new generation rose, when doors that once opened effortlessly now required knocking. The same voices that praised him for reshaping a decade grew quiet, indifferent. He realized then that the industry didn't love him. It loved the version of him that sold records. And when that version was no longer needed, stepped aside without a backward glance. This betrayal taught him the coldest truth. Fame is not a companion. It is a tide. The one he could never forgive. Himself, Gary, saved the final name for last because it was the heaviest. It was the boy from Islington who had carried too much doubt into adulthood. The young man who expected betrayal before trust. The artist who sometimes pushed too hard, feared too deeply, loved too cautiously. He blamed himself for not protecting his heart better, for letting ambition blur moments that should have been held, for believing that success would heal what loneliness had carved. And when he whispered, "I can never forgive the fifth," he wasn't speaking of cruelty, he was speaking of regret, quiet, human, universal. Because sometimes the betrayal that lingers the longest is the one we commit against ourselves when we refuse to allow healing. The room had grown almost completely silent by the time Gary finished speaking, as though the air itself needed a moment to absorb everything he had finally allowed to surface. Outside, dusk settled over London in muted shades of gray and gold, the same colors that had framed so much of his life. Inside, he sat quietly, hands resting in his lap, no longer trembling, only still. A kind of peace, fragile yet undeniable, hovered around him. He had lived through triumphs that reshaped an era, through losses that reshaped him, through betrayals that etched themselves into the softest parts of his memory. Yet now at 69, Gary seemed lighter, not healed, not absolved, but simply unburdened by the weight of words left unsaid. He looked toward the window, toward a city that had watched him rise, stumble, and rise again. The reflection staring back at him was older, softer, but truer than ever. A man not defined by the betrayals he carried, but by the courage it took to name them. And as the last of the daylight slipped away, Gary whispered something almost too faint to catch, a sentence shaped more by acceptance than sorrow. In the end, can a life be understood through the wounds it survived? Or are we meant to keep certain pains close so they remind us of who we once were?